Thank you for joining me for the Daily Bread Bible Study. We are at day 293 for Monday, October 19th, 2020, focusing on Mark chapters 15 and 16. We are looking at the end of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' death and resurrection, and the accounts that we have here in the Gospel of Mark. Just a reminder, too, that the Gospel of Mark is likely the earliest written Gospel, and we'll discuss in chapter 16 how we think the ending of the book of Mark is maybe a little shorter than what is given here in the text. But moving on into Jesus' time of passion, Jesus is handed over to Pilate in Mark 15 and then makes no replies that would indicate that he is claiming to oppose Caesar or claiming to be a king in himself. Pilate offers to release a prisoner, Barabbas or Jesus, and provoked by the chief priest, the crowd ask for Barabbas to be released. In Mark 15, verse 12, Pilate spoke to them again, "Then what do you wish me to do with the man that is called the King of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. The guards mock and beat Jesus and dress him in a purple cloak and a crown of thorns. They then swap out after the beating the purple cloak and put on Jesus' own clothes and lead him away to be crucified. Simon of Cyrene carries the cross to Golgotha, just like in the Gospel of Matthew, and he is crucified with a sign saying, "The King of the Jews." So as he is there crucified on the cross, the taunts roll in, including in Mark 15:31, "He saved others, he cannot save himself." In verse 34, Jesus quotes Psalm 22. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus then gives up his spirit and dies. Unlike Matthew, the Gospel of Mark describes only the curtain of the temple curtain being torn into, and the centurion proclaiming, "Truly this was God's Son." Mark does not mention what Matthew includes, the earth shaking, the tombs being opened, or the plot to cover up Jesus' resurrection. Instead, just the basics are given, and the women watch the scene and witness where Joseph of Arimathea lays the body. In Mark 16, on the first day of the week, the women who witnessed what happened and where his body was laid, they go to the tomb and wonder who will roll away the stone by the entrance. They find the stone already rolled back, and a young man robed in white sitting to the right. Note, he's not explicitly called an angel. This young man proclaims what angels normally say, though, saying, "Do not be alarmed." So this young man, this is the second time a young man has appeared in the Gospel of Mark. The first time was there in Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the young man's robe was pulled off. But here, this young man is not only robed, but robed in white. So this neoniskos in Greek, this young man, is there again. The young man continues, "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised, and he is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." To this, the women leave in shock. In Mark 16, verse 8, So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the point I mentioned at the beginning. Scholars believe this is the original end of the book of Mark, since some manuscripts in Greek omit the verses 9 through 20. Now, if this is the case, the idea is obvious that more happened to the story, right? Why would disciples care about reading this book that ends in this tragedy? Why would there be disciples at all who would follow Jesus if there wasn't more to the story? Again, remind you, the Apostle Paul, his writings come way before the Gospel of Mark is written. And also, the Gospel of Mark is likely the earliest written gospel, written shortly after the destruction of the temple, the second Jewish temple, there around 70 A.D. So, what's going on here? Well, we see that the story of this is the disciples get to finish the story, right? The story becomes completed in the telling not only of the disciples, but also in the other Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John. They combine to express a narrative of the resurrected Jesus in the accounts. And even this little bit, this end, to the part of Mark, which I'm not sure what time it was written, but this addition to the Gospel of Mark feels very similar to the Gospel of Matthew and Luke in what they are trying to tell and create the narrative of what is happening with Jesus. So we continue on to translate the available manuscripts in English, and we learn that Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, sounds very similar to John, and that others do not believe her. Jesus appears in another form to two of the disciples, which sounds like the Road to Emmaus story in the Gospel of Luke. And also, again, the report is that they are not believed, which sounds very similar to the Gospel of Luke, dismissing both the women and also these men as kind of being amazed by it, but not fully believing. Finally, Jesus appears to the apostles themselves. This is minus Judas, of course, and before the other apostle has been appointed to replace him. That will be in the book of Acts. Mattathias, I believe, is his name. But anyways, he commissions them similar to the Gospel of Matthew, and then ascends into heaven. Thus, the longer end of the Gospel of Mark concludes in verse 20. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied it. This sounds like a very fitting imagery. This sounds like what we know as disciples. This sounds a lot like setting up the book of Acts and talking about all the signs and what the disciples of God and Jesus do there in the book of Acts to grow the church. So we know the story. We know the ending in our hearts. We know that even in our day and time, we as disciples, though we are very numerous at this point in time all across the world, we know that this is the story of our faith. The Christ of our faith, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the one who gives us peace and life and hope. This is our story and how we complete it. And I invite you to continue to move faithfully with God, to follow that Spirit's lead, and to act with boldness just as we can, because we have a resurrected God who gives us life.